With the knowledge now and the confirmation that the U.S. has been involved in strikes on Iran, let's bring back senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube. She is on the phone for us. Courtney, what else are you hearing from your sources?
Yeah, so what we're trying to figure out right now exactly what Richard is talking about, and that's the targets. We do not believe that the U.S. anyway was involved in any kind of leadership targets here, but what we have been hearing in recent days and what we were expecting out of these strikes was the U.S. Sending a message about either Iran's ballistic missile program or their nuclear program. Now, we already saw with Midnight Hammer a pretty strong message back in June where they struck 3 different sites. They were able to basically implode at least 2 of those during those strikes. But we know now from President Trump and from Secretary of State Marco Rubio and others in the Trump administration that they were concerned that Iran was beginning to rebuild its program. But it's not just that. In recent days, we've been hearing more about their ballistic missile program. That is not new. That program has been building and advancing in recent years, especially with the help of some allies of Iran. And we heard from President Trump in the State of the Union that he was concerned about them trying to pursue an intercontinental ballistic missile that could strike the United States. That also isn't new. In the Defense Intelligence Agency here in the United States has been warning that as part of their space-based program, Iran has been trying to pursue an ICBM and may in fact have several dozen of them by 2035. So because of that, among the possible targets here would be their ballistic missile program, and specifically anything that would either send a sign or really impact their growing program for an intercontinental ballistic missile. Again, it's not a new program, but their growing program in that. Again, we're still trying to figure out exactly what the U.S. and Israel struck here and exactly where. But those are among the things I would expect the U.S. would be involved in here. Not necessarily leadership, even though there's been a lot of talk of regime change, but more trying to have a real impact or at least send a signal against the Iranian nuclear program or ballistic missile program.
And Courtney, we know that in Iran, the first day of the week is actually on Saturday. It's Saturday morning there. We know millions of people were either at work and in school or on their way. Do we know anything about perhaps the protections or the extra warnings that were given to attempt to protect civilian life?
You know, as far as the U.S. piece of that, the U.S. has brought in additional assets for air defense all throughout that region. And I think, you know, everyone expects when they're talking about air defenses, it's Patriots and it's THAAD, these sort of ground-based programs, these big missile launchers and things that take, you know, big C-17s and C-130s to bring them in. But just having those Navy ships there actually provides a tremendous amount of air defenses. And remember, the U.S. and Israel, they have been preparing for things like this. They have seen strikes by Iran against Israel, against assets in the region, against U.S. bases in the region even. And so because of that, over the last, I mean, frankly, since October 7th, really, but especially over the last year or so, they have brought in additional air defenses there. I've been talking to U.S. officials about the possibility of these strikes for days now, as I'm sure many reporters have. And when I ask the question, are you confident that you have the air defenses or the ability to defend against an Iranian retaliation where you need it throughout the region, officials continue to tell me yes, that they were very confident in what they have there. They just didn't want to go into the specifics.
Courtney, when I spoke with Keir and when I spoke with Richard Engel earlier, they had both said that there was no clear indication that this attack would come tonight. And we know what they say about hindsight. Given the fact now that we know the U.S. was involved, given the fact that we heard President Trump say from Texas today that he was not happy with Iran and that force may need to be used, was that the hint? Was that the indication that this was coming sooner than later, that look, Iran, time has run out. We've been at this for weeks. The negotiations were not going the way Israel and the U.S. wanted. Was there a clearer indication then that any of us really thought that this was going to happen tonight?
Yeah, I think there was a clear indication that it was imminent. It didn't necessarily point to tonight, but definitely that something was imminent in the coming day, 2, 3 days, whatever it was. But I mean, I will say, when the Ford moved further into the Eastern Mediterranean, it became more clear that something was, at least they had everything that they needed if the president were to order this. But I totally agree. When the president said that, his tone had changed. He wasn't talking as much about hopeful diplomacy, and he was talking more about how he seemed disappointed, frankly. He seemed disappointed that the talks hadn't gone the way that the United States wanted, and that was definitely a bit of a sign of what was likely to come.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.